Okay, so we are getting back to, let's see here, our Moneyball book. We're going to look at chapters 5 and 6 here over the next few minutes. So in the last chapter, chapter 4, we got into Bill James a little bit, and which is where sabermetrics comes from. And we also learned about Alderson, right, which is the GM before Billy and taught Billy or opened Billy's eyes to the sabermetric approach. So there's two opportunities for teams as it relates to Bill James's philosophy here. And these opportunities are to implement James's knowledge inside the game, right? So Bill James has written these baseball abstracts, as he calls them, which are the findings of his own research, but nobody's implemented it inside the game. So that's one opportunity from the A's perspective. Also, there's this opportunity to extend Bill James's philosophy to other areas. For instance, Bill James didn't say that much about the draft itself, other than the fact that college players were better values or more likely to make it to the majors than high school players, and that was about the extent of it, right? But you could take sort of his philosophy and apply it beyond just where he applied it. So what is Bill James's philosophy? I mean, yes, he's into stats, right? But what's he really doing with those particular stats? He's using a certain method that you all learned in junior high, probably. He's using the scientific method, basically, right? He is hypothesizing some relationship. At a most basic level, he's hypothesizing a relationship to runs scored, and he's hypothesizing that certain stats are related to runs scored and more so than other stats, right? So he's looking to test these hypotheses with evidence, just like the scientific method teaches us, right? And the amazing thing is this wasn't happening in baseball at all at that point, right? So he's looking to see, does batting average lead to runs? Or is that highly correlated to runs? Or is home runs more correlated to runs? Or, as he eventually finds out, on-base percentage and slugging percentage are actually better predictors of runs, with on-base percentage being even better than slugging percentage. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, perhaps. And he's always sort of seeking. This is where he finds the fun. He's always seeking answers to his different hypotheses and also looking to upend conventional wisdom, right? The rules of thumb or the heuristics that scouts were using. He takes a lot of joy in saying, look, you scouts are way off base here, and that's what the evidence, the statistical evidence shows. There's lots of remaining questions, right, in terms of extending James's philosophy, in terms of when and how you use relievers and what value they provide in baseball. Defense, right? He doesn't get into defense really at all. And then the draft, as we talked about and as a lot of this book focuses on, including this chapter as well as a few others. So relating to the draft, there's two players that they talk about in Chapter 5, Jeremy Brown and Steve Stanley. Who are these guys? Why talk about them? What's their part in the story? Jeremy Brown's a catcher, right? Roll Tide, catcher from Alabama. I don't really like Alabama, but Roll Tide is pretty catchy. Steve Stanley's a Notre Dame center fielder. But both these guys, they don't have MLB bodies, right? They're not going to be selling any genes as gene models relating to something that was talked about in an earlier chapter. But they get stuff done. Their performance is great. They're college players. They're playing on good college teams in good college conferences, which means the competition they're playing against is pretty good. So what do the A's do, right? They want to draft them, but they draft them a lot higher than other teams would have drafted them. Why? Well, for one thing, they can't afford really high draft picks. the players that everyone else are going after, they can't really afford to pay them. So they go to these players beforehand and they say, hey, you're like a 8, 9, 12 round pick, is what the projection is. We'll pick you in the 3rd round if you'll sign for 5th round money, right? Well, if you're a player and you're thinking, and your agent's thinking that you're probably going to go around the 8th or 9th round, and a team comes to you and says, I'll pick you in the 3rd round and we'll pay you 5th round money, that sounds pretty good, because I was thinking I wasn't even going to go till the 9th round anyway. And I'm excited about going to play for this team, right? So this has some positive effects in many different ways, right, that help the system itself work. But Billy gets pretty upset prior to the start of the draft. What's he so upset about? They've got a board. Their board doesn't look like anybody else's, which is good, right? Because they can maybe get more of those people on that board if no one else is interested in them. But he gets pretty mad because there's one player on the board, Nick Swisher, that he knows other teams want, right? And it looks like maybe the Mets are going to get Nick, even though they don't even really want him, right? But he's at the top of Billy Beane's board. So he gets pretty upset about that. The draft itself gets labeled in the book the Billy Beane Show. Right? Why is the draft called the Billy Beane Show? Well, it's because it's literally his show, meaning he's running it and disregarding, in a lot of cases, what the scouts are telling him to do. And this is a really hard position to be in. Think about this. So yes, he's the boss, but he's got all these people that work for him. These people have lots of traditional baseball knowledge. And him and his assistant, Paul DePodesta, are basically just disregarding them, right? And of course, these scouts are not happy about this, right? So he's running the draft like the Billy Beane Show. He even fires the lead scout. It's a risky proposition in terms of the interpersonal relationships and his relationship with other general managers and his reputation inside of baseball, right? Not quite as risky as it relates to the A's themselves, because they had a low payroll. They were probably going to lose anyway with that payroll. So there wasn't as much opportunity cost to implementing the system with the A's as there would be with the Yankees, where your other option, your opportunity cost, is pretty good to sign big-time free agents, right? So they've got 20 people on their big board in the draft in this chapter. How many of those 20 do they get? They get 13 of the 20, which is pretty amazing, and just shows that they really did have a big board that was different than everybody else's, right? Their big draft board are their players that they wanted. That's what big board means in draft terminology. A lot of other teams didn't want them, so they were able to get them, pick them up. And they drafted the players that they wanted a little bit higher rounds, and the reason, as we discussed at the start of this slide. So market inefficiency. This is really, although they kind of touch on it a lot in this particular chapter, this is the theme of the entire book for the most part. So there's some really key points here about what market inefficiency means. It's called a failure of imagination in the book. What does that mean, a failure of imagination? How is inefficiency a failure of imagination? Well, it's because a lot of the scouts and the other GMs, they couldn't imagine a player that was, for instance, short and fat, being fast on the base pads, or being a good fielder, right? But Billy Beane and Paul DePodesta, they didn't care what the player looked like, right? All they cared about was the stats, and they could imagine a player that looked like anything performing, right? They didn't let looks influence performance. And so that becomes an inefficiency when there's no link between whatever you're discriminating against. So in this case, it's body type. If that doesn't relate to actual performance, then it's a real inefficiency in the marketplace, and that leads into the next question here. Got a typo there. It should be when you rule out an entire class of people. Apologize for that. So how is inefficiency discrimination? Well, we all discriminate all the time, right? We have discriminatory tastes. Maybe you like Coke better than Pepsi. Maybe you like lager better than stout beer. Maybe you like French roast coffee better than a light coffee or a breakfast coffee. We all have discriminatory tastes. We all discriminate amongst people, right? That's what a draft is all about. You're trying to discriminate between the people who are better at baseball and will produce runs or stop the other team from producing runs, and players that won't be as good at that. But when you're discriminating based on a quality that does not relate to that performance, that's very inefficient. We can think about that with those of you that, if you took the rivalry class with me, one of the other classes I teach, we talk about the Red Sox and how for a long time as an organization they racially discriminated. We talk about the Montreal Canadiens and how they discriminated against English-speaking players for a long time. So those are two cases where it's very inefficient discrimination, sports-wise, because you're discriminating on a quality, the color of someone's skin or what language they speak, that doesn't relate directly to the output in sports performance. And it's going to hurt your team, right? So DePodesta, he gets excited about this, right? He likes this idea that other teams are very inefficient in their discrimination because he sees opportunity, right? He's like, if they're going to discriminate based on home run hitting, well, that's not as correlated to runs as on-base percentage, so I'm discriminating based on on-base percentage, and I'm going to take advantage of this market inefficiency. So he likes that a lot because other GMs are going to overlook the players that he really wants, right? They talk about how labor is a separate market in Oakland. What does that mean? It's a separate market in Oakland. We've got this Major League Baseball labor market, right? You've got all these teams playing in it. But they're all discriminating based on the 5 tools. Oakland is discriminating based on something totally different, right? So the labor market for them looks completely different than the labor market for everybody else. Chapter 6. So the subtitle of this entire book is Winning in an Unfair Game, right? Where's the dumb subtitle? Something like that. The Art of Winning an Unfair Game, right? So this chapter 6 talks about why this game is unfair, right? What's unfair about baseball at this point, right? Well, at this point, this is before luxury taxes and the revenue sharing that we have in the game today. The game is unfair because some teams are in bigger markets and they have a lot more revenue coming in compared to other teams in smaller markets with less revenue coming in. The TV contract for the team in Cincinnati is worth a lot less than the local TV contract for the team in New York or LA or Chicago or Houston, right? Those are big markets. There's more eyeballs there. Advertisers are willing to spend more to put ads in those games, so local TV companies are willing to pay more for the rights to those games. So how do you win in an unfair game? Well, there's the quote here that explains it pretty well. If we do what the Yankees do, we're going to lose every time, right? The game's unfair. The Yankees have an advantage. We've got to do something different than the Yankees if we're going to try and win at this game. So the Blue Ribbon panel is appointed to look at this disparity in baseball, revenue disparity in baseball, and propose some potential options to the then new commissioner, Bud Selig, who himself was the former owner of a small market team, the Milwaukee Brewers. Right, so he comes in as commissioner and he's interested in doing something about this revenue disparity. So they asked Billy Beane to testify because they're like, Billy Beane, your team is an outsider, you're an outlier. Your team is winning with a very low payroll. Why is this happening? Right. Well, Billy Beane, he's somewhat deceptive when he testifies, right? So his own numbers and his own knowledge from the numbers tell him that fans care about winning, and fans will come out if you're winning, whether you have stars or not. But that's not really what he tells the panel. He tells the panel that, yes, we're winning, but we don't have superstars, and fans like to see superstars, so our winning is not helping us produce revenue, right? So what he tells the panel basically is that there's not a lot of marginal revenue per win in baseball. When in reality, he knows that there is. There is additional revenue for every win that you get. It's not all based on superstars. Why does he tell the panel this? Well, because he's a small market team and he wants revenue sharing, right? Like he would, even though he's got this system that is starting to work, he'd still like to have more money to spend. Who wouldn't want more money, right? So what happens to the A's in 2001 in the offseason? Well, we kind of talked about this at the very start of the book, right? This is part of what forces the A's hand into doing something different than what everyone else is doing, right? They lose these free agents. They lose Johnny Damon, Jason Giambi, and Jason Isringhausen, right? They know they can't replace these players superstar-wise, but they know also that they just have to try and replace the statistics of these stars, right? Billy also has another plan to raise some revenue. It's called selling the closer. So what does this mean, selling the closer, and why is this a money machine? Well, he figures out, again, this is about inefficiencies in the marketplace, that if you put somebody in the closer role, they could be a mediocre pitcher or worse, and they'll still rack up a bunch of saves because you're putting them in the game at an opportunity when saves are almost guaranteed. Not guaranteed, but are very likely. And he knows that the market highly values saves, the labor market in Major League Baseball. So he will put mediocre pitchers into the closer role, run up their save numbers, and all of a sudden all these other suitors around the league are coming trying to sign a particular player, this reliever that has lots of saves, when he knows that they're just a mediocre pitcher, right? So he's using this as revenue. He's selling the player, the closer, off after he rings up a bunch of saves for them by putting them into that closer role. Replacing Johnny Damon. So this particular question here is very relevant, if you will, to your NFL draft project, or really any project that you want to undertake where you're trying to figure out how do you accomplish a certain task, right? So DePodesta knows that they want to win games, right? How do you win games, right? Well, you got to score runs, right? So he's looking at what MLB stats are most correlated with wins or most correlated with scoring runs, right? So in football, this might be, well, I know I got to score points. What offensive stats are most correlated to scoring points, right? What defensive stats are most correlated with not allowing points, right? Or reducing points allowed. And what's he find? Well, he finds that on-base percentage and slugging percentage are most correlated with scoring runs. There was this OPS, which was on-base percentage and slugging percentage added together. But what does DePodesta find something else out in his analysis when he's looking at which of those stats individually is more correlated to scoring runs? He finds out that, on-base percentage is a lot better predictor than slugging percentage. And slugging percentage is still better than home runs and better than batting average. But he says, I need to adjust this equation. Instead of treating these two things as equal, if I'm just adding them together, on-base percentage and slugging percentage, I'm treating them as equal. I need to treat on-base percentage as 3 times more than slugging percentage because it's 3 times better predictor of runs than slugging percentage. So the AVM system is like this stats system, computer system that models every single play that happens in baseball and assigns it an expected run value, right? So how many runs can I expect based on a large sample of past history when a certain hitter hits a ball to a certain position on the field and gets to a certain base, right? How likely is that to lead to a run score, right? So DePodesta purchases the system, and then he creates his own system, right, to help the A's figure out what are the most important plays to make to score runs, right? So how is this related to replacing Johnny Damon? Well, what the system allows him to do is figure out what Johnny Damon's defensive ability was. So Johnny Damon could stop certain plays from happening defensively in the field, right? And they could figure out, well, how many runs is he reducing the other team by, right? And they found out about 15 runs during the season. So they had to figure out some way to replace these 15 runs, either offensively or with other defensive adjustments, right? So they're looking at Damon as a cog in their system. And they actually found out that his offense is not that hard to replace. Harder to replace was his defense, right? So hopefully these chapters are starting to get you to think about this sports as a system, right? And how you can use stats to think about what you're ultimately trying to accomplish, right? So it's taking some of the subjectivity out of it. We're going to talk about that a little bit in a later chapter. And it's trying to make it more objective now that we have the software programs and the statistics to be able to really hone in on our predictive ability of different actions that we take. So that's all I have for chapters 5 and 6. We'll pick up in the next video with probably we'll go 7 through 10. Maybe we'll go all the way through the end of the book, perhaps. That's it.